Donald Trump just walked away from his own trade deal, the one he called the best trade agreement ever signed by the United States. And Mark Carney did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He said one sentence, and that sentence is now being replayed in every trading floor from Toronto to Tokyo. This is the story of how a president tore up his own legacy to prove a point, and how the quiet man in Ottawa let him do it, because he already knew what happens next. 6 years ago, to the exact day, the United States, Mexico, and Canada signed a deal that was supposed to run until 2036. A trilateral agreement covering more than $1.6 trillion in trade every single year. An agreement Donald Trump personally negotiated, personally signed, and personally praised as the most modern, most balanced trade deal in American history. He called it, in his own words at the signing, the fairest and most beneficial trade agreement the United States had ever made. On July 1st, that agreement hit its first mandatory review, exactly as written into the original text 6 years earlier. And the Trump administration had two options sitting on the table: extend it for another 16 years, locking in stability until 2042, or refuse and drag all three countries into a decade of open-ended renegotiation with no finish line in sight. Washington chose refusal. The announcement came from the United States Trade Representative, who told reporters on a call that the country would not agree to renew the agreement in its current form, not cancel it outright, not walk away completely, because walking away completely would require 6 months formal notice and would trigger immediate panic across three economies. Instead, something colder, something more calculated, a deliberate decision to leave the deal in a permanent state of limbo, reviewed every single year instead of locked in for over a decade, renegotiated one clause at a time, indefinitely, forever hanging over the heads of automakers, farmers, energy companies, and manufacturers who built entire supply chains assuming this agreement would hold steady until at least 2042. Here is what makes this different from every other Trump tariff headline you have seen this year. This was not a tweet posted at midnight. This was not a threatened deadline that quietly expired without consequence. This was a formal, on-the-record refusal delivered by his own trade representative on the exact anniversary of the deal taking effect. Trump had been signaling it for weeks before it actually happened. In June, he stood in the Oval Office and said the words that are now being dissected in every trade ministry across North America. He said America does not need anything Canada has. He said America does not need anything Mexico has, but that they need everything America has. And he said, almost as an afterthought, that they have to treat us better. Sit with that for a second. This is the same man who once called Justin Trudeau a great partner during his first term. The same man who signed this exact deal in 2018 and called it the fairest, most modern, most beneficial trade agreement ever made by the United States. And now, 7 years later, he is standing in front of cameras saying the country does not need its two closest neighbors at all. That is not a small shift in tone. That is a complete reversal of the entire premise he built his first term legacy around. So what does Canada actually have that the United States claims it does not need? Start with oil, because oil is where this story gets its teeth. Canada is the single largest supplier of crude to the United States. Not Saudi Arabia, not any OPEC nation. Canada. American refineries across the entire Midwest are built, physically engineered, around heavy Canadian crude flowing south through pipelines that have operated for decades without interruption. You cannot simply swap that supply chain out with a phone call or an executive order. The infrastructure itself was designed around this specific relationship. And yet the trade deficit tied to that oil, alongside other goods, has become Trump's central complaint in every negotiation session. The numbers themselves are staggering when you actually look at them. A goods trade deficit with Canada that reached roughly $48 billion last year, and with Mexico close to $200 billion. Trump sees those numbers as definitive proof that America is being taken advantage of by its neighbors. Trade economists see the exact same numbers very differently. They see integrated supply chains built over 3 decades, chains that cannot be dismantled with a press release, no matter how forcefully worded that press release might be. Now bring steel and aluminum into this picture. Canada is one of the largest suppliers of both metals to the United States, feeding directly into American construction, automotive manufacturing, and defense production. Trump has already placed 50% tariffs on both metals, tariffs that by some independent estimates account for roughly 60% of all tariff revenue the United States has collected from Canada this entire year. Add lumber to that list. Add dairy. Add the automotive sector specifically, where individual car parts sometimes cross the Canadian and American border 5 or 6 separate times during assembly before a single finished vehicle ever rolls off the line. Every single one of those border crossings depends entirely on the exemptions written into this exact agreement Trump just refused to renew in its current form. This is where Mark Carney enters the story. And if you want to understand why Carney has become the single most disciplined counterpart Trump has faced across this entire trade war, you need to understand exactly who this man is and where he came from. This is not a career politician who climbed through party ranks. Mark Carney ran the Bank of Canada through the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. Then he ran the Bank of England through Brexit, one of the most turbulent periods in modern British economic history. He became Prime Minister after Justin Trudeau resigned, stepping directly from central banking into the highest political office in the country. And he won that election specifically because he promised Canadians he would stand up to Trump without flinching, without theatrics, and without giving away leverage in public. His campaign built itself around a hockey term that Canadians instantly understood: elbows up, a defensive posture, controlled, deliberate, designed to absorb pressure rather than escalate it. And when reporters asked Carney to respond to Trump refusing to renew the deal, watch what he did not do. He did not escalate. He did not threaten retaliation. He did not call an emergency press conference. He said something almost dismissive, something that should genuinely worry anyone betting against Canada in this negotiation. He said what he has seen with this president is that you are never close to a deal, and then suddenly you make one. Translate that sentence carefully because it is doing a lot of work. Carney is telling the world, and telling Trump directly, that he has already priced in the chaos, that these dramatic walkouts and public threats are simply the opening act of a negotiation, not the ending of one. He has watched this exact pattern play out before across trade talks with dozens of other countries, and he refuses to be rattled by it in public because being rattled in public is precisely what hands Trump the leverage he wants. That single sentence is the entire Carney doctrine compressed into one line. Stay calm, keep the cameras rolling on your own terms rather than reacting to someone else's, and let Trump's own volatility become the story instead of your reaction to it. It is a strategy built by someone who spent 2 decades reading financial markets for a living, And markets, more than almost anything else, punish panic and reward patience. Let's talk about what actually happens now mechanically, because the deal does not simply vanish overnight the way some headlines are implying. The agreement stays legally in force all the way until 2036, regardless of this announcement. What changes is the process running underneath it. Instead of one clean 16-year extension locking in certainty, the three countries now enter a rolling cycle of annual reviews, year after year after year. Every single year, the agreement gets reopened, poked at, threatened again, renegotiated in small pieces. Imagine trying to plan a 5-year factory investment, hiring hundreds of workers and committing hundreds of millions of dollars in capital, when your core trade protection could theoretically be renegotiated every 12 months. That ongoing uncertainty is arguably more damaging to long-term business confidence than a single dramatic collapse would have been. A clean break at least gives companies a firm deadline to plan around and adjust to. This arrangement gives them nothing but permanent, low-grade, compounding anxiety stretching out for a decade. 3 scenarios sit in front of us now, and each one changes the entire shape of this story depending on which path gets taken. Scenario 1. Trump uses the next 12 months to extract real, tangible concessions from both neighbors. Tighter rules of origin that force significantly more automotive manufacturing back onto American soil. A hard cap on Chinese-made goods flowing through Mexican or Canadian supply chains specifically to dodge existing American tariffs. If Carney and Mexico's government calculate that offering targeted concessions now prevents a much larger economic shock later, Trump gets to walk into next year's midterm elections claiming he personally rebuilt the entire deal on America's terms. A tangible win he can put his name on and campaign on, much like he did successfully with the original signing back in 2018. Scenario 2. Nothing meaningful moves at all for an extended period. Trade experts are already predicting this outcome may actually be the most statistically likely one, given the political incentives on both sides. Politicians in Washington and Ottawa talk past each other straight through the American midterms. The annual review process becomes a formality nobody in either capital takes seriously, and businesses on both sides of the border simply learn to operate inside the uncertainty the same exact way they have already learned to operate inside a full year of tariff threats and reversals. In this scenario, the story quietly fades from the headlines, but never actually resolves itself, becoming background noise rather than breaking news. Scenario 3. This is the possibility nobody in Washington particularly wants to say out loud on camera. Canada and Mexico accelerate what they were already quietly doing behind the scenes long before this announcement, diversifying away from American economic dependence entirely and permanently. Canada has already been actively pushing new liquefied natural gas contracts toward Asian and European markets, deliberately reducing reliance on the exact pipeline infrastructure Trump has always assumed will keep flowing south no matter what happens politically. If the United States keeps treating this relationship as fundamentally disposable, it may simply be teaching its 2 closest and most integrated neighbors to stop needing it back over time. And once that kind of foundational trust is broken between longtime allies, it does not repair itself automatically just because a different administration eventually takes office years down the road. Here is the part of this story that deserves far more attention than it is currently getting in most coverage. Canada was one of only 2 countries in the entire world, alongside China, that chose to formally retaliate against Trump's tariffs. rather than simply absorb them quietly and wait for the storm to pass. That specific decision has now become, according to Trump's own administration officials speaking on the record, one of the central sticking points on the table in these ongoing negotiations. In other words, Canada's willingness to fight back rather than fold has not remained purely a domestic political story for Carney's approval ratings at home. It has directly and measurably shaped how Washington is now treating the entire bilateral trade relationship going forward. Standing your ground in this particular case came with a real, specific, and quantifiable economic cost attached to it. And yet, watch what Carney does next, because this is actually the more interesting and more revealing move in the entire sequence. Instead of purely playing defense and waiting for Washington's next move, he is expanding outward in parallel. Canada has been actively building new trade relationships across the entire Pacific region. Japan, the Philippines, and other markets hungry for stable, reliable energy partners willing to sign long-term contracts. Every single one of those new agreements functions as a quiet insurance policy against exactly this kind of moment, a moment where Washington decides, on a single Wednesday afternoon, that it simply does not need you anymore. This is the strategic lesson sitting underneath all of these headlines about tariffs and trade deficits and annual reviews. Dependence on a single trading partner, even one as close, as integrated, and as historically friendly as the United States has been to Canada for generations, is fundamentally a vulnerability. And vulnerabilities eventually get exploited, whether intentionally or simply as collateral damage from someone else's domestic political calculations. Carney understood that specific risk the moment he took office following Trudeau's resignation, and virtually everything he has done since then, from the aggressive Pacific diversification push to the calm, almost bored public messaging around Trump's threats, has been building steadily toward reducing that exact exposure. Ask yourself something honestly, without the noise of daily headlines clouding the question. If the country supplying roughly a quarter of America's crude oil, along with massive shares of steel, aluminum, lumber, and finished automobiles, can be told in a single press conference call that it is simply not needed at all, what does that actually say about how this administration views alliances that were built and reinforced over multiple decades? This is not merely a trade story about tariff percentages and deficit numbers. This is a preview, a genuine preview, of how far Washington is currently willing to push every single one of its long-standing international partnerships if the raw numbers on a balance sheet do not satisfy one man sitting in the Oval Office. Now compare Canada's position to Mexico's in this exact same moment, because the contrast tells you something important that most coverage is missing entirely. Mexico has already entered formal bilateral negotiating rounds with Washington, with one round completed in late May and two more scheduled through the end of July. Canada, as of this recording, has not entered that same formal process at all. On paper, that might look like Canada is being sidelined, pushed to the back of the line, while Mexico gets Washington's attention first. But sit with the alternative reading for a moment. Entering formal negotiations under pressure on Washington's timeline, while tariffs are actively being threatened in the background, is not obviously the stronger position to be in. Mexico is negotiating because its economy is more immediately exposed to abrupt disruption. Canada, by contrast, appears willing to let the clock run, let the annual review process become the venue rather than rushing into talks that could lock in unfavorable terms simply to look proactive on television. There is also a domestic political angle here that shapes everything happening in Washington. A growing number of Republican lawmakers in Congress have already shown a willingness to break from Trump, specifically on Canadian tariffs, worried about the impact on farmers, manufacturers, and auto workers in their own districts ahead of the midterms. The House has already voted against certain tariff measures targeting Canada earlier this year, a rare and notable crack in party unity on a signature Trump policy that matters here because it means Trump's leverage inside his own party is not unlimited. The louder the economic pain gets back home in swing districts that depend on cross-border manufacturing, the more political cover Carney effectively gains simply by staying patient and letting that pressure build on the other side of the border. Industry groups inside the United States are making this same argument publicly, and they are not exactly natural allies of Canada or Mexico. Major manufacturing associations, the same groups Trump frequently credits with supporting his tariff agenda, have published reports this year praising the existing agreement and warning that prolonged uncertainty around its renewal threatens the very manufacturing renaissance Trump claims to be building. When the president's own coalition starts publishing data that undercuts his own position, that is not a small crack, that is a genuine fault line running directly through his own political base. There is a longer historical pattern worth pulling into focus here as well. This is not the first time Trump has threatened to walk away from a major trade agreement, only to eventually sign a modified version of nearly the same deal. During his first term, he threatened to tear up the original agreement with Canada and Mexico entirely, calling it a disaster for American workers, before ultimately negotiating and signing this exact successor agreement back in 2018. The pattern is consistent enough that trade analysts have started treating it as a predictable negotiating style rather than a genuine policy shift. Threaten total collapse, extract concessions under the threat of collapse, then sign a version of the same underlying structure while declaring total victory to supporters at home. If that pattern holds again here, the eventual outcome may look far more similar to today's agreement than the dramatic headlines currently suggest. The real question is not whether some new agreement eventually gets signed, but how much damage accumulates to trust and long-term investment in the meantime, while all three countries wait for the theater to run its course. Here is my honest read on where all of this realistically goes from here. Trump does not actually want to destroy this relationship entirely, because destroying it would hurt American manufacturers and American consumers just as badly as it would hurt Canada. What he wants is leverage inside the relationship. Refusing to renew the agreement outright is fundamentally a pressure tactic, not a genuine divorce filing between three integrated economies. But pressure tactics only work for as long as the other side genuinely believes they have no viable alternative left on the table. And Carney, deliberately, patiently, methodically, has spent his entire first year in office making absolutely certain that Canada always has one available. That is precisely why his public response to this entire crisis was one calm, almost throwaway sentence instead of an emergency press conference filled with threats and ultimatums. He is not negotiating like a man who believes he has no leverage remaining. He is negotiating like a man who has already quietly built himself a viable exit route and is simply waiting patiently to see whether Washington ever actually needs to use it against him. Markets have already started reacting to this uncertainty in ways that rarely make headlines but matter enormously to ordinary people on both sides of the border. The Canadian dollar has shown noticeable volatility in the days following the announcement, swinging against the American dollar as traders try to price in a decade of rolling annual reviews instead of a single stable number they could plan around. Automotive stocks with heavy cross-border manufacturing exposure have wobbled as well because every analyst covering that sector understands the same basic math. A car built partly in Ontario, partly in Michigan, and partly in Mexico only stays profitable if the parts crossing those borders keep moving duty-free. Any hint that those exemptions could tighten sends a ripple through supply chain planning that takes months to fully absorb. And here's a detail worth sitting with, because it rarely gets mentioned alongside the bigger political headlines. Roughly 90% of Canadian exports currently move into the United States under exemptions carved out specifically by this agreement. That is not a marginal slice of Canada's economy. That is the load-bearing wall. When Washington signals that the agreement itself is now permanently unstable, it is not threatening some peripheral sector. It is threatening the central structural support of Canada's entire export economy. That is exactly why Carney's calm public posture is such a deliberate and calculated choice, because panicking publicly over a threat to your central economic structure only invites more pressure, while absorbing it calmly signals you have already built alternatives quietly in the background. Watch the next 12 months of this story extremely closely. Watch whether Canada's Pacific diversification deals continue accelerating in scale and scope. Watch whether Trump's negotiators actually show up to the table with Canada the same way they already have with Mexico, which entered formal bilateral talks weeks ago, while Canada still has not. And watch closely whether that one calm line from Carney ends up aging like genuine strategic patience, or like simple denial dressed up as confidence. One more thing worth considering before we close this out. Every single time this relationship has gone through a period of open conflict, from the first term tariff threats through this latest refusal to renew, the two countries have eventually found their way back to some working arrangement because the underlying economic gravity pulling them together is simply too strong to ignore for long. Factories do not relocate overnight. Pipelines do not get rerouted in a single fiscal quarter. The sheer physical infrastructure connecting these two economies acts like a kind of ballast, slowing down even the most dramatic political rhetoric until reality eventually catches up with it. That does not mean this moment is meaningless. It means the drama tends to move faster than the underlying economics ever actually can. That gap between political theater and economic reality is exactly where Carney has chosen to operate. And it may end up being the smartest strategic decision of his entire time in office. Rather than matching Trump's urgency with urgency of his own, he is betting that patience, diversification, and a refusal to be provoked will outlast whatever comes out of Washington's next press conference. Whether that bet pays off depends entirely on how long Canadian businesses and Canadian workers are willing to absorb the uncertainty while their prime minister plays a longer game than the news cycle usually rewards. Tell me in the comments section below which of these three scenarios you personally think actually plays out over the next year. Concession, prolonged stalemate, or a quiet, permanent divorce between three economies that used to be inseparable. And if you want the next update, the very moment either side finally blinks first in this standoff, make absolutely sure you are subscribed to this channel, because this particular story is nowhere near finished, and the next move could come from either capital at any time.